I guess I've got a really strong interest in making the company flourish, but in a real win-win. Let's really figure out why we're here, what we could do that would be the best possible kind of outcome, and how we maintain everybody, going along that line.
My guest today is Dr. Fiona Kerr. She's the founder of the Neurotech Institute and Focus NTI Consulting, combining qualifications in systems engineering, cognitive science, psychology and anthropology with nearly 40 years in the industry. She is globally recognised for her work on the cognitive science of both human to human and human to technology interaction and how this informs practice. Of particular relevance to our audience includes work with medical practitioners, technology companies, governments and policymakers on creating sustainable human-centric healthcare and ageing solutions. Other areas include robotic, bionics, AI design, ethics and defence, with ministerial advisory roles in Australia and Finland. Dr. Kerr holds honorary academic positions with SAHMRI and the University of Adelaide. Welcome to Hacking Health. This podcast is for future-focused health experts, thought leaders and change makers who are interested in making health accessible for everyone, because together we can get to the future faster. What first sparked your interest in the field of neurotechnology and health tech?
So I originally did an anthropology and then a psych degree, and I was working in, power stations, mines, those kind of things. But about 50, I went back to university, and because I got really interested in building complex systems, complex adaptive systems, and that was about organisations, it was about technologising structures. So I did a systems engineering PhD. About halfway through, I thought, okay, beautiful, that's feedback loops, it's the way a system behaves, whether it's a human system or a ecological system. But why do some people think and understand that much better and others don't? So then I started looking at the cognitive science. So I brought that into the PhD. So I ended up looking at almost wet and dry neural networks, like what are the neural networks to do with systems, engineering wise, and what are the networks to do with our own brains? And that became really interesting. And it kind of put me in the middle. I never expected it to, but it kind of put me in the middle, because I started with the engineering group looking at robotics, those kind of things. And I was the one saying, yeah, but we can make it do this, but that's not how it's going to interface with the human, because the human won't do that, and which means our outcome will be different. And they were saying, yeah, but that's just the soft people bit. Yes, but that's going to change the outcome. We are going to interface with the human, so we've got to take that into consideration. And of course that plays out everywhere. It plays out with healthcare, it plays out in education, it plays out wherever you technologise things. And we saw it was playing out with increasing, screen time and all those kind of things. And health tech particularly was interesting because there were obvious times when it was going to be better to have a human. So what do we lose, if you like, if you technologise it? And then there was the other side, which was the amazing, wonderful things of being able to create technologies that can go inside, often inside, that was the neurotech aspect, to change all sorts of things around how our body works, to improve things, to take away problems, to give micro doses of drugs where needed and when needed, and chase cancer cells and do all those kind of things. So they got really interesting.
You're part of many different boards, types of organisations and things. What have you learned by being on boards, and what do you think you bring to the table?
I guess no matter what the board has been, when you have an aligned set of goals and a really clear purpose, I guess for me, and aligned values, that's core. Without that, you're not going to get anywhere. And then to augment that, very good data, and that basically means that you've got really good information, and that's quality as well as quantity. So very good data sets, but also having that voice from the floor in a way that you get nuanced information as well. So you're not just picking the data that fits the questions you want to ask. I guess what I bring is that complex thinking. So I love the strategic aspect of setting something up, very long. I like looking at all of how the bits interact.
Yes.
But I also have a lot of operational experience. So I was in operations in, General Motors and mines and pharmaceutical companies and for the first 30 years of my life. And so that's really useful. And I guess I've got a really strong interest in making the company flourish, but in a real win-win. Let's really figure out why we're here, what we could do that would be the best possible kind of outcome, and how we maintain everybody, going along that line.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. For all the stakeholders.
Yeah. And that's asking all of the difficult questions as well. What don't we know? What's the disconfirming information? Where are our blind spots? How do we make sure that we get that information? Are we getting those weak signals to say things are changing? What are we doing about that? So that's really critical as well.
And what data do we need to ask for to make sure that we confirm or disprove whatever we think might be happening? Because that kind of gut feel is important as well on a board, not just the data. But
that's right. Yeah. In fact, the most strategic organisations, so having looked at leadership and having a PhD in leading adaptive organisations, the best strategy is the board that has good data, that's that quantity data, quantifiable data, and then also we'll turn to everyone and say, right, Sarah, you've had 10 years experience about this. What do you think? And that is as legitimate. And having people on there that don't just like the sound of their own voice, that actually have thought about that, means you're going to get very good quality data. And you can also help steer them towards that too, in asking those critical questions. Because if you have high trust on a board, critique is really valuable. If you don't have enough trust to critique, your board's not going to work.
No, that's a problem. Are there any exciting developments or projects that you're currently working on that you can share?
I can share? Yep. So I'm working with a number of governments now and private companies on successful hybridisation. So when COVID hit, well, way before COVID, I was looking at how we're different over screens, working with people like Jari Haitanen in Turku in Finland around what changes over a screen and what doesn't.
Changes in brains?
Yes. Is the real me the screen me, is how I'd put it.
Yes.
Or when do you have to be face-to-face?
Yes.
In fact, doing a Department of Defence project, we were looking at, how often you have to be proximal to your team to maintain alignment and high trust. We've known for probably 30 years that virtual teams, the most important thing is virtual trust. The most difficult, fragile thing is virtual trust.
Right.
So it's always been an issue, and it was always fascinating around why, what's the difference? So one of the fascinating things that I delved into more and more was what happens when we are directly interacting with another human and in the same proximity. So we have a number of things that change. Direct eye gaze creates all sorts of electrochemical changes in our body and our brain. And a lot of that doesn't happen over a screen. More of it happens when you know the person already, and I'll talk about why in a sec. And then there's dynamic resonance, which is when we're moving together in the same space, especially if we're doing something like walking together and that kind of thing. We entrain at almost cellular level in a lot of ways, but that includes emotional entrainment, and includes a number of other factors that start that brain-to-brain kind of chemical and electrical interaction. We have touch. If you shake someone's hand or if you pat them on the arm, that kind of thing. We've got C fibres in our skin, which are really rich in taking information into your brain, and it's especially the emotional kind of aspects. So that's that bonding situation that happens, and that's this cascade of electrochemical activity that we don't get any other way. And again, it's not over a screen. Then we've got a thing called the volatilome, which is like your genome, but it's the chemical cloud you've got around you.
Okay.
So we have thousands and thousands of chemicals.
Okay.
We can measure about 3,000
Okay.
that we swap when we're in proximity.
Oh.
So when you and I are sitting here, we're
swapping chemicals.
we're swapping about, we can measure thousands of chemicals.
Quite
and
creepy.
It lets us read the room. It lets us really tune in to the other person. We pick up loads of information we don't realize we're picking up, so massive amounts of communication. It also lets you know, it lets you sense. We talk about, tuning in, radar, just gut feel, sense. A lot of that is around lots of that information that we pick up. And interestingly, well, most of them are in our emotional sweat, which sounds awful, but it's not. It actually changes bonding methods in humans. It also changes how we think and the decisions we make as well, the level of comfort, the level of trust.
So in board decisions, like really having people in the room is really important. Like
Absolutely.
You miss out on a lot by not.
You do, yeah.
By having people on the screen.
Yep, that's right. Because the fifth one is direct interbrain synchronization. So I could show you a picture. I always do when I'm speaking. In fact, the favorite picture always is two pilots that one's an experienced pilot, one's a new one, and then it shows what the signals are doing because they've each got a cap on their heads, so with electrical activity, EEG cap. And you can actually watch the brains talking to each other and who's the sender and who's the receiver and how strong it is and how long it's going. So again, if we capped the two of us now, we would be watching that. And because we know and like each other, it would be really strong. And that's a very powerful part of interaction. And in fact, we did a 3-year study on with the American Department of Defense on, do you make different decisions if you're proximal to another human being than if you have your trusted autonomous robot? And yes, you do. But one of the actual academic studies was having someone on their own doing a difficult problem over a screen, a technology. And then the other half of the people had a stranger, so not even that friendship relationship, but a stranger. And they had to do something collaborative, positive, but collaborative.
Yes.
And that electrochemical fuel, if you like, the activity that you start stimulating and all of those oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, and lots of the firing, that's the same fuel between interbrain synchrony that your own brain has to use when it's solving a complex problem, which is intrabrain synchrony. So we know that the brain collaborates across all different parts of it. And the more that the brain can be fueled up, the more of the brain it brings to a problem, the better we are at solving the problem.
Okay, yes.
And so the people that got that stimulation, and then one of the people left and the other one on their own solved a complex problem, they solved it faster, they retained information longer, they applied it better, their score was higher.
Wow.
So it really does start to show you that we have quite a direct impact on all sorts of things. And with complex problem solving, that becomes really important in health when you think about people actually being there to be able to talk to patients, because it's not just the patient that will change the way they think and the compliance and what they tell you. They'll tell you, give you more nuanced information. It also includes the practitioner and clinical decision making. It's more nuanced. They get better radar. They get more data that's relevant, wider data. So if we go back to boards, over the last 2 years, the global studies have showed that with those boards that don't come into the same space, the transactionalism around board decisions has increased sharply. So the quality of board output is dropping. Has dropped.
Wow.
Yeah, so they need to get back into the same room.
Yeah, some of my boards people are sometimes on the screen, sometimes in person. I think it's time to all get back together.
Yep, it definitely is. And there's so many pieces of data around the sudden spike of improvement in strategic capability when they bite the bullet and do that.
So cool.
And the amount of board people I've spoken to afterwards who say,
we already knew
it
that.
actually does make a difference.
Know that. Yeah. Can you briefly explain the difference between neurotechnology and other health tech areas?
Okay, so neurotechnology is quite specific. It is a neural connection. So you're wiring something up to the brain so that it either can monitor or it can be changed by what's happening, with neural networks. So that's whether it's a brain-computer interface, whether it's something that you put into the brain.
So there's been some news about stroke victims being able to start using limbs again, and
yes, so you can stimulate. You can turn parts of the brain on. You can turn it off. You can read parts of what's going on. You can use brain activity to be able to better understand all sorts of delivery. So a cochlear implant is a really good example.
Okay.
So in talking about human interaction, because that also gives you those lovely extra kind of electrochemical activity boosts, if you're using something like bionics, then that can help the bionics to learn to integrate in the body. So years ago, I met Dimity Dornan, who was Hear and Play up in Queensland. So that was looking at cochlear implants for children.
Okay.
And she just knew, without all of the technical training, she knew that if you got the child stimulated and playing and enjoying it, and that it became a family affair, that they were going to learn to hear more quickly. Because when you put a cochlear implant in, it isn't a case of just turning on, and now we can hear. The brain has to actually connect to it, and it has to grow together to do that. Then it has to learn that is a sound. Then it has to differentiate the sounds. Then it has to start identifying what each of those mean. Then it has to kind of basically code them. So that it takes a long time.
Yes.
And the more stimulation you can get, especially around the head and the face, there are more fast-track plastic neurons, and if you can stimulate them, then you're going to get quicker sort of
integration.
learning. Integration and two-way kind of interaction.
Okay.
And so she was the one that got me onto Bionics Queensland, because she said, that's the science about why what we do works. So she's wonderful to work with, and so is Robin Stokes, who's the CEO of Bionics. And so I got to judge one of the years the Bionics Queensland kind of, and the people coming in with their new ideas about being able to have that neural interface and how it can stimulate parts of the brain. In fact, years ago, you said what got me interested. So one of the things I never expected was to become a speaker, a public speaker. Because really I just talk about, isn't this fantastic? And look what it could do for you. And I figured out really quickly that that's why I'm not nervous, but also it's why people like it, because it is interesting and it's very practical. What can this do for you tomorrow? And so I was talking about some of the direct interaction and how amazing this is. And Jordan Wynn was a young man on the same sort of circuit, and we kind of went together. So he did I think his PhD was on being able to drive a wheelchair with a head strap. And so he was very much in love with the tech, and I was saying, well, but what about this? And so we made this wonderful kind of pair and actually did a catalyst on a young man driving a buggy. That's right. With the, mind you saw Jordan, you didn't see me because he's young and cute, which is not fair. That kind of thing became really fascinating. And the problem we had there was because the boy could only use his eye muscles.
Yes.
Once you'd used that up for kind of starting and stopping, you had to find another way of him being able to steer. Right. And I had just done that 2-year study on the neurophysiology of touch and eye gaze on healing and therapeutic relationship. And I'd been looking at that C-fibre firing. So that was an idea of, so could we stimulate that and get that C-fibre attenuation going and kind of have him think about that kind of activity. And so those kind of problem-solving things were really interesting.
Oh my God, I could talk to you all day. What are some of the common myths about neurophysiology and of using technology to improve health?
The biggest one for me is figuring out, it's better understanding the neurophysiology of the human, the human-to-human interface, because it is so rich in terms of what it does. Whether you are just looking at someone or talking sort of affiliatively, warmly, or you are touching them, they set off all sorts of very strong vectors of communication and electrochemical pathways that alter all types of things. They calm down your nervous systems, they boost your immune system, they increase kind of trust and hope, they change decision making around whether or not you're going to change a habit that's bad for you or comply with, medicine taking and those kind of things. So we are really powerful. I do a lot of talks to senior and junior medicos around, their superpower. And if we understand that doesn't mean you don't use tech. So along with that, it's what technologies are around that take away the drudge work or really help you when you maximize your capacity to exercise that superpower. And the other side of that is what don't you technologize? And the mix, an example of the mix. So I work in Finland, and years ago was there for a Futures of a Complex World conference, and then I was talking with VTT, which is like their CSIRO, but very well sort of set up. And they were looking at different technologies, and one of them was preventative health apps. And it's a case of saying, okay, so we know that an app on its own doesn't change behaviour for long. The tail of the change in, habit is not there. But a lot of that is from my work was because you don't get that boost of chemicals right at the start that you get if you sit down, if you're my doctor and I'm sitting with you and we're going through how we could use this and how a behaviour change might work and what that would do to me midterm and long term. And if I trust you and we've had that information and we've had that interaction, then again, I start the parasympathetic nervous system firing. I start all kinds of different electrochemical interactions in my brain and body. And one of the things that happens when you have to break a habit is you have to actually break and take apart the old neural network and make it, like the old spider web gets broken up and a new one has to be created. So direct human interaction assists with that. It's just the kind of chemicals that you need for neurogenesis and neuroplasticity and that lovely fuel we talked about earlier. So if you have that boost and then you have something like an app which supports and scaffolds, your change in behaviour by reminding you, then that works a lot better. And the thing we were looking at then was, all right, so you front load with humans and then how often do you need the human to top that up? And that's a really fascinating area. But again, it's the combination. So it's how do you combine them together? And then when do you just not use technology at all? So that's another whole area because sometimes technology blocks what is very useful to do with the interaction. And other times you just have to, sort of make up the difference. So we know that Gerontech, we know that trying to do telehealth with older people, for example, has all sorts of issues around them being able to hear and see, turn on the technology. You also don't get chronic problems over telehealth. You get an acute thing, but you miss out on those things which are slowly underlying, decreasing in kind of capacity or increasing in seriousness over time, and that's at any age. So there's again a lot of good data on what's useful about it, but then how often do you have to come into direct interaction? So for me, working in somewhere like Finland where they ask those questions, my gig is to ask the questions, to say what don't we know and what questions should we be looking at, and having a 30-year plan on artificial intelligence and how you use that. You get completely different outcomes because you get a beautiful marriage, that partnership. So my work there is partnering with artificial intelligence for a human-centric future. And it means that you look at all of that. And the other thing is, with having Neurotech Institute, the more you know about that, working with things like the young robotics, guys versus the great big companies, they've got their sailing ship sent. They know what they want to make and they're off and running. But the young ones, the new ones, when you're saying to them, well, that technology looks fantastic, but that's not how the human's going to interact. So if we know, for example, that we need the 2-year-old to have more direct eye gaze stimulation from their mum to counteract X, how would you do that with that tech? And so you give them this completely different goal, and then they're fabulous then at...
They go for it.
Yeah, they go for it. So in the end, it's the question that makes the difference. You know, you've got to have those really high quality human-centric questions, and then technologizing that is amazing.
So some neurotech is almost like sort of working on hacking your brain. Your research has touched on the ethical considerations in neurotechnology in particular. So can you discuss this and how some of it works in practice? That's what's most interesting.
Yes. Well, there's defence stuff I can't talk about.
That's fine.
The health. So one of the things that is a really good example, so a very good example is something like the bionic eye. So that's part of augmentation. And I know that some people argue that we're already, you know, sort of bionic before you have an augmented something, if we have something replaced. But whenever we're looking at augmentation, we need to look at what are you augmenting? So what are you hacking into? What is
a bionic eye?
So the bionic eye is a lens that allows you to see really well. So what we've got at the moment is one of the main problems with our eyes is that they degenerate over time.
Yes.
And that we can get all kinds of things that make the eyesight deteriorate.
Yes.
So often in medical technologization, what we're looking for is improving the situation or taking away the possibility of degradation. So if you replace the lens with a bionic lens, you have no glaucoma, you have 20/20 vision at 30 feet, you have slower macular degeneration. So you've got a number of positives, and there's also the capacity potentially to deliver drugs straight into the eye through the bionic lens as well. So there's a number of really positive things that can do. But then we get into the ethical considerations, so that it uses a camera. And as soon as we get into that, again, my work, especially overseas, is saying, okay, so if we're going to use, say, an augmented eye, a bionic eye, then we have issues around who do you augment and what for, and who gets to use that camera, who's in control of the camera. There's some work now on being able to send the images to something like a phone. And if I'm sitting in another country, you know, do I have the right to look through your eyes? And then it's what happens if we turn it off? Then we know what and who can turn it off and when and why. Who owns the data? In some countries, the company that made the bionic eye owns it.
Right.
In other countries, the government owns it.
It's on the terms and conditions.
It's very, very specific. And that kind of stuff isn't discussed nearly well enough. And then you've got the problem of if we have an augmented eye for something like a defence situation, then if they leave, do you de-augment them? And so it's so much trickier than we think about. So they're kind of thinking about that you know, spyware and James Bond kind of being able to hear in other places.
But also like the security and defence aspects as well.
Yeah, that's right. So you've got the straight physical and you've got that human aspect of medically it helps. So very often with technology and with any kinds of advance like that, we've always got that double-sided problem of you can use things for good and you can use things for evil. And that's why ethical AI in defence, but ethical AI in medicine, because you can never keep it corralled to one. You know, it will go wherever it goes. So again, advising the big national AI group with their 30-year plan, we're much more about trying to get global alignment on the ethics of this, because you need to really think about, again, it gets back to, do you want quality AI with human-centric outcomes? And if you do, the goals are very different than if you
just want to make it move as fast as you can.
Yes, move it fast, make more money, get rid of humans. And that on one side, that's the dumb AI, if you're looking at some companies and how they use AI, but even really fancy AI like bionic eyes or augmentation of all sorts, we've really got to not do it first and then think afterwards when things go wrong, which is what humans do. We always do that. We run forward because we love the bright, shiny, and then we make the mistakes and we don't measure them properly. But finally, when they hit us in the face, we go, oh, we need to. And they're usually the social ones, and the environmental ones. So we're really beholden to put that into the mix right at the beginning before we start.
Yes.
And to say, who is this for? Who benefits, who doesn't benefit.
And there's such an opportunity to do that now.
Yes, and there always has been.
Yes.
And I guess what I notice is some countries are really good at that.
Yes.
And some aren't.
Okay.
So we need to get better at that, because we could definitely be, good.
Thanks so much for coming in today.
Oh, you're welcome.
We're going to keep the conversation going in our private Facebook group, You Legal for Doctors. You're welcome to join us there.